Therefore the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden. He drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubim, and a flaming sword which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life. The Conclave Bible, Data Links.
The modern mind, whether in its subconscious collective dream or in its intellectual citadel of vivid awareness, is a stage on which is contained and reenacted the entire experience of the human race. Marshall McLuhan, The Mechanical Bride, Folklore of the Industrial Man. Alpha Centauri was created in 1999, following the departure of Sid Meier and Brian Reynolds from Microprose. After the release of Civ 2, they sought to try something different for their new company, Firaxis. The idea was for a sequel of sorts to Civ, in that following the space race victory, this game would then portray the experience of those colonists on their new planet in the Alpha Centauri system. It was an incredibly ambitious and unique strategy game, not only for the heavy philosophical themes that were imbued into the project at the express intent of Brian Reynolds, but also for the far more dynamic and reactive setting upon which the game takes place. The planet is not like that of Earth in Civilization 2, a largely dead and static battle space existing only for the sake of resource extraction and warfare. Planet was a truly living world, one which would not only react to environmental pressures, but also express its own will as an independent entity, only increasing its activity as the game progressed in response to that of the human colonists. Despite the simplicity of the game being that it was basically just a Civ 2.5, this dynamic planetary environment gave the game a degree of variability which is arguably still not matched by even more modern games in the Civ series. With Civ 6 you get somewhat more active Earth, however that was only after copious amounts of DLC, with honestly the results still being pretty underwhelming. You can nuke the ice caps to flood the planet, achieving a tactical Dutch victory, but the results are not as multifaceted as in Alpha Centauri, where it can feel almost shameful to scar the planet with your doomsday weapons. More than the gameplay, however, what keeps people interested in Alpha Centauri is its story and themes. It presents a strictly post-national environment, which is frankly quite odd the first time you play. You as a player are transported into what is more or less the end of history, at least in terms of what a lot of neoliberals would imagine it as. A ship apparently commissioned by the UN, guided by a UN charter and called the Unity, which unites the passengers under a shared set of vaguely Western liberal values, is racked by an unexplained mutiny and eventually breaks up in the ensuing conflict. Various factions form from the survivors as charismatic leaders arise and rally the people under their personal ideological visions for the future of humanity. The liberal end of history is itself ended, abruptly and violently, leaving nothing but chaos and disorder on the surface of the planet. There are some attempts to reunite the different branches of mankind that spread around the world, but in general, in most people's games, those end in failure, unless you're playing as the peacekeepers. The colonists are reduced to a state of survivalism, setting the stage for new development of civilization across this new world. However, this place, often reverently called planet, even by the most cynical factions, is not a dead rock, but a world with its own biosphere of advanced life forms, animals and fungus-like creatures primarily. Initially, these seem like simple flora and fauna to the colonists, but as the colonies develop and interact with the planet ever more, they grow to realize the intense level of synchronicity between the life forms and even the planet itself. This place is not merely a biosphere like that of old Earth, but a unified being existing on a planetary scale, and that being is about to awaken. That is the core dilemma at the heart of Alpha Centauri: how exactly to respond to an awakening alien god. I mentioned this idea of the end of history, and that is not without reason. Many of you may have heard before of the neoliberal concept of the end of history, developing out of the fallout and collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War. It's important to place Alpha Centauri squarely in this context as a product of the late 90s spirit. Naturally, you will see that the factions and representation the player is given in the game reflects this historical context, and undoubtedly a similar game made today would present a very different set of ideological cutouts to serve as the player's foundation. But frankly, the reason they have remained relevant today, instead of becoming laughable caricatures, as many political themes in media often turn into, is because they really are just cutouts, generic broad positions you can place yourself into as a player in order to give yourself some degree of restriction and help guide you. They are in no way a strict restriction unless you really want them to be. For me, I enjoy the Gaian faction, but frankly, I also can't help myself from digging boreholes everywhere, even if they do upset the planet, due to the massive returns they give. Alpha Centauri and classic civilization in general was great precisely because you always have this flexibility to transform your society in order to suit your own desires. Though a small limitation upon your freedom, for example, choosing your civ or faction, you gained a strong foundation from which your empire could grow and change in relation to other empires, and of course to the world itself. So if Alpha Centauri is placed squarely at the end of history, what happens after the end of history? That's what I think Alpha Centauri explores, the restructuring and re-evaluation of a society after it has reached its supposed end, and what humanity might become in that undiscovered country of the far future.
Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 1.
You have not experienced Shakespeare until you have read him in the original Klingon.
To speak of humanity, I think a short summary of the various factions will be useful for helping to establish the scene. There are 7 factions in the base game and 7 more added in the Alien Crossfire DLC. All of them, at the start, are more or less strawmen, representing some sort of monolithic 20th century ideology. What makes them interesting is how they grow and develop, both through the relations with one another, as well as the planet itself. But in addition, through your relation to them as an outside force, the player. While this game is not really story heavy, it does an amazing job at creating an emergent narrative with all these ingredients combined with the player's relationship to them. Of the original factions, first off are the Spartan Federation. The game describes them as militaristic, and while they are, I'd say their core ethos seems to be one of survivalism and social Darwinism, with an odd mix of some libertarian rhetoric that doesn't seem to actually have any expression in their society, aside from the fact that apparently everybody is fully armed in the Spartan society. So I guess the right to bear weapons is the only kind of libertarian holdover they carried on. Next are the Gaians, or Gaia's stepdaughters. This is honestly my favorite faction, along with the Lord's Believers. Gameplay-wise, the Stinky Hippie faction can become quite a powerhouse, as they can achieve a level of unity with the planet that few others can. They are the anti-authoritarian and align closely with the work of Henry David Thoreau. Despite espousing pacifism, however, they seem to have quite a few quotes relating to military conquest, which I've always taken to heart when playing as the Gaians. Think less Walden and more Ted Kaczynski. University of Planet is a group of technocrats and vaguely NRX types. They're anti-tradition, and their primary goal is to push the boundaries of human science and ability even further. Zakharov is a popular character with fans, mostly because he constantly owns everyone else with facts and logic, and is a massive threat to literally everyone due to how quickly he can amass advanced technology. The Peacekeepers are the closest to what I would call the liberal international mainstream today. They act as more or less the moral center of the game, as far as the average Westerner is concerned. They are incredibly bureaucratic and constantly whining about human rights, which increasingly comes across as tone deaf within the new context of this alien planet. The Human Hive is another fan-favorite faction, mostly because of how uncompromisingly brutal Chairman Yang is as a character. They're extremely authoritarian and collectivist, but retain a powerful aristocracy or management of sorts to, manage all the drones. They're described as being Chinese legalists, but honestly, despite Yang being Chinese, they come across more as just a caricature of Orwell's England in 1984. Just more logical and relying less on manipulative propaganda and more on, abuse of biology and technology. The Lord's Believers are another faction I quite like, not just because Sister Miriam constantly has the best dialogue in the game, but they also make for the strongest military faction by far. They seem to be the most disliked faction online, but this mostly comes from Redditors who just hate Miriam being right all the time. The last of the original factions is Morgan Industries, led by their namesake Nabutake Morgan, who also names every single structure and product after himself. They are a singular corporate entity and highly capitalistic, ruling a largely decadent society. They also seem finely tuned for an economic victory, and like the university, can become a major threat if others let them have their way. Morgan himself, as like a leader, is largely amoral, but in a positive way. He's seemingly beyond conventional morality, beyond good and evil, I guess you could say. Morgan and his followers don't really have any explicit goal beyond expressing their will to power, and will do so through the most efficient means, mainly capitalistic monopoly of the planet and people, rather than military conquest, unless it's really necessary. I won't go too much into detail regarding the Alien Crossfire factions. While they are fun to play, except the aliens, they have interesting characters. None of them really come up to the level of the original in terms of their narrative or unique storytelling possibilities enabled for the player. The one faction I will mention is the Nautilus Pirates, because they're most OP human faction in the game and are incredibly fun to play. This is the faction you want to go with if you want to pull a William of Orange and flood the planet. Now, if you're expecting a deeper dive into the individual ideologies of each faction, I won't be doing that. Fact is, as I mentioned before, the factions themselves are not terribly deep. However, they don't really need to be. Their purpose, again, is to allow you to develop that ideology naturally through emergent gameplay. And this brings me to the topic I'd like to focus on for this video, that being the dialectic nature of that intersection between gameplay and narrative elements. In my opinion, the most important and impactful dialectic present in the game is not between the various factions, or even between the player interacting with their own faction, but rather between the player and the true protagonist of Alpha Centauri, the planet itself. Now, I imagine for the average, generally knowledgeable person, the primary association of the idea of the dialectic in their mind is the Marxist theory on the matter, his dialectic materialism. However, I'd like to explore the concept more generally and focus more on Hegel's ideas specifically, which, while influencing Marx, are still distinct. In its basic form, the dialectic takes the form of a dialogue, especially one between two individuals discussing a topic. This has been at the very heart of basically all Western thought since at least Socrates. But Hegel took this a step further. His view, to put it simply, was that a dialogue doesn't just exist between two arguments, but between all things in nature throughout history. Wherever there exists a contradiction, imperfection, there is a dialogue between opposing forces. That is the dialectic for Hegel. Naturally, of course, a perfect being, a perfect existence, could have no dialogue because there's nothing to discuss.
Some would ask, how could a perfect God create a universe filled with so much that is evil? They have missed a greater conundrum. Why would a perfect God create a universe at all? Sister Miriam Godwinson, But for the Grace of God.
Now, with this extremely broad view, you can basically apply the dialectic to anything, as many Hegelians have an annoying habit of doing. Nietzsche, and more specifically Deleuze, both chafe at the habit of Hegelians to paint even critique of their theories as participating in them. However, I'd like to indulge my inner Hegelian for a moment and dive into his core theories a little bit, if only to explain myself later. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel is one of the few truly comprehensive philosophers in Western history. His aim was to create a system which encompassed all of human history, all of human existence and thought. And he achieved this within his lifetime. Even if you disagree with his ultimate assertions, you must contend at least with the monumentality of his work. The core of all of this is the dialectic. And that concept is best explained within his work, the Phenomenology of Spirit, specifically one section regarding the master and slave dialectic. In this segment, he speaks mostly in parables about the emergence of self-consciousness out of general consciousness. As consciousness emerges, it begins to recognize that it can act according to its own will, that it is a force. Next, that there are other forces in the world, and that it is a force independent of those other forces. From this first differentiation comes desire. It, the will or the consciousness, desires what is not it. And through desire, it comes to act in opposition to the independence of these other forces, inevitably negating them. By overcoming these other forces, the will knows itself as an independent being. Thus, through desire, it seeks to negate everything around it. Consider the example of a man and a tree as a simplified idea. A man desires the tree for its value to him, as lumber maybe to build something. Thus, he negates the tree as an independent being in order to subject it to his own will. He eliminates the tree as a tree and transforms it in service to him into lumber, dominating it. By dominating that which is external, one comes to know oneself as a masterful being, and the initial stage of self-consciousness is reached, and the being is assured of its own self-conscious and will. However, what happens when two willful or masterful beings, two self-consciousnesses, inevitably interact? Well, they seek to negate one another, to dominate as they do with literally everything else around them, leading to the instrumentalization of the other as a way to assure the truth of one's own independent being. By necessity, the other must not be an equal being, or else the independence of oneself is negated. Both beings seek to manipulate the other as an object until this is no longer viable. Hegel's parable imagines this as a death struggle, where each being seeks to negate the other in order to prove itself independent, the result of which, if both survive, being that one inevitably yields in the face of its own fear of death, and is rendered as a slave to the other, the new master. In this dynamic, the master retains his initial state of being, one of unfettered will and desire. The slave, however, must enter a new state, as an instrument of the master, denied recognition of his own self-consciousness, acting upon the master's desires in lieu of him. This state of affairs, while resolving the initial conflict between wills, is innately unstable. Ultimately, what one desires is recognition as an independent self-consciousness, to affirm your own knowledge of your own self-consciousness. And between these two beings, that is not achieved. The master recognizes himself, of course, but sees no equal in the slave, as it is only an instrument of his will as the master, and not an independent will in itself. Thus finds no satisfaction in the relationship. The slave, meanwhile, recognizes both himself and the master as independent wills, yet gets no recognition from the master in return, again creating an unsatisfactory state of being. Adding to this, by willfully becoming an instrument of the master's will through his own fear of death, the slave negates himself and is transformed, becoming what Hegel recognizes as a higher state of self-consciousness, in that he recognizes the value of his own life in being an independent will. The master, while dominant, lacks this understanding and is thus trapped at a lower state of self-consciousness. There is also the aspect of seeing oneself reflected in the world around us. While the slave sees himself reflected in his own work, the master is totally divorced or alienated from the products of his own will, and in effect becomes spiritually enslaved himself by being dependent upon the slave in order to act upon his will. This parable is not really meant to be literal, and Hegel develops it further than this, but it is representative of how man behaves when facing the world, and when contradicted by other wills beyond his own. We may not literally enslave everyone we meet, but we do instrumentalize those around us and manipulate them as tools to our will, negating them in the process. In addition, we also find ourselves trapped within cycles of dependence and alienation from our own labor, but more in a spiritual sense as opposed to the purely material one espoused by Marx. Notably, this is best represented by the relationship between Gendo Ikari and his son Shinji in the series Neon Genesis Evangelion. Notably, Shinji only achieves full self-consciousness when he can simultaneously recognize his own self in the selves of others, as he also recognizes their own recognition of themselves in him. Likewise, while Gendo becomes increasingly detached from the work of his subordinates, including Shinji as an Eva pilot, Shinji himself grows to see his own self reflected in his works and takes pride in it, again becoming more self-conscious.
僕は僕だ。ただ、他の人たちが僕の心の形を作っているのも確かなんだ。そうよ、碇シンジ君。やっとわかったの？バカシンジ！
For Hegel, the dialectic is a constant flow state from being to negation to becoming. However, unlike Nietzsche's eternal recurrence or will to power, Nietzsche does imagine an end state where all are united in mutual self-consciousness with God in what amounts to basically the kingdom of heaven. Hegel was deeply Christian, and his work is as much one of theology as it is philosophy. Now, why do I bother bringing this up with regards to a decade-old strategy game? Well, to dig further into my idea of the true being at the center of this narrative, the history of Alpha Centauri is not man, but planet. Ultimately, Alpha Centauri is a story about achieving self-consciousness and how this develops from a primitive to advanced state through its relation to others, notably the humans occupying planet. The planet is a consciousness which prior to the landfall of humans existed within the empty void of space. Total freedom, but no context from which to differentiate itself from another. Thus, no true self-consciousness. Landfall brings about a contradiction to the planet, a distinct other existing as an antithesis to itself. I could be bound in a nutshell and count myself a king of infinite space, were it not that I have bad dreams. Now, planet is an extremely responsive place. It can either aid or hinder the player greatly depending on your relation towards it. The climate change and geological features of other Civ games honestly pale in comparison to how hard Planet will try to crush you if your opposition to its developing alien will is sufficient. But this goes both ways. Working with the planet gives amazing benefits, and this is another reason why the ecological hippie faction is one of the most powerful in the game, as well as offering the most telling quotes regarding the true nature of Planet. All this reactivity is no mere geology, but a result of the planet mind beginning to awaken and come closer to the emergence of full self-consciousness. It's never made perfectly clear how the planet mind actually functions, or how it can cause huge geological effects like mountains uplifting or volcanoes. But what is stated is that it is connected to the fungus which coats the planet, acting as a sort of neural net. Deidre of the Gaians gives us some key information about the development of consciousness across the planet in this quote.
The fungus has been planet's dominant life form since about the time of the Lower Paleozoic on Earth. But when once every 100 million years or so, the neural net at last achieves the critical mass necessary to become sentient, the final metamorphosis kills off most of the other life on the planet. It is possible that we humans can help to break this tragic cycle. Lady Deirdre Skye, Planet Dreams.
I think this quote is the most telling as it directly implies the dialectic nature of man's involvement with the planet. In isolation, self-consciousness could never develop, but through contact with a distinct independent will in the form of mankind, Planet is suddenly plunged into this ongoing development which man himself has been undergoing since he first achieved his own consciousness. This involvement of the planet in the dialectic is not a passive one, but an active death struggle as Hegel describes, as the primitive self-consciousness seeks to assert itself and express its own will upon these new external entities. The native creatures of Planet, by contrast, seem mindless themselves and entirely serving the will of Planet. Thus, their own activity also serves to support the contradiction between man and planet. The fungus, as well as the other life forms of Planet, represent an order totality, or an absolute being, however, one still lacking in the development to become fully self-consciousness. In further bits of information, mostly coming from Deidre, the contradiction between man and planet, or as the planet calls them, Earth humans, is further emphasized. Much like C.S. Lewis's Out of the Silent Planet, Earth is firmly established to be a dead world, a world where man is totally alienated from the divine and from himself, which is a contributing factor to the extreme disunity between the various human factions, and often within them as well. Considering how awful life can hypothetically become for citizens of certain groups, alienation defines man in this context, from the level of the drone, or especially the gene jack, to that of the entire species from his old and newfound homes. Man expresses this alienation in how it behaves on planet, largely exploiting it as the master exploits his slave, leading to Hegel's unhappy consciousness, or state of dissatisfaction. You can feel this intense dread as the game progresses, as it becomes ever more pessimistic and grim in its tone, despite the incredible power you unlock through your progress. Now, while there are many outcomes to Alpha Centauri as a game, narratively there is one inevitable outcome mentioned earlier. That is the full emergence of the planetary consciousness. You as the player represent the mediating will between these contradictory forces radiating across the planet, as it is through you and your experience that this synthesis can occur. The final attempt by humans to dominate the planet and negate it, enslaving it to their will, comes at the climax of the game with a secret technology, the voice of the planet. In many ways, this represents the last-ditch effort to fully force the submission of the planet to man's will, at the cost of mutual destruction. Naturally, this effort fails, leading to massive fungal blooms across the planet, as well as huge geological shifts and even global flooding. Mechanically, this technology doesn't really do much. However, it does enable any faction to begin the ascent to transcendence, the endgame project turning the game into basically a race towards ascension. The Ascent to Transcendence secret project is where the true synthesis occurs, where not only man and planet can be fully aware in their recognition of one another as independent beings, but all the disparate branches of mankind can be united within a new absolute. This is Hegel's true end of history, as opposed to the false end, which characterized the fall of Earth and the breakup of the liberal unity of mankind in the beginning. As stated in the final cinematic, no longer are there separate beings, but all are united in their shared gift of consciousness. This is not unlike the Christian idea of theosis, or in the Catholic Church, divinization, where ultimately all beings are united in the light of God. This, in Hegel's view, is the ultimate goal of history, or telos. But it is not a firm ending, but rather a new state of becoming and self-mastery. The new planet mind has now reached a higher level of understanding, beyond that of its constituent parts, leaving the potential for a new dialectic to continue onwards as this absolute being interacts with the wider universe, singing the song of consciousness until the ends of time and even beyond. From a Hegelian perspective, the entire narrative could be seen as the unfolding of spirit, in a broad sense, encompassing things like consciousness, reason, and divine purpose through a dialectical process. Mankind represents an earlier, less developed, and more alienated stage. Planet represents a more harmonious and integrated stage. The player's journey and the conflict between the two worlds allow for the spirit to realize itself more fully by overcoming the limitations of each and achieving a higher, more self-aware understanding of the universe and its divine order. Even if you disagree with this perspective, it really is just one possible outlook. The greatest thing about Alpha Centauri is how it serves, first of all, as a narrative engine, rather than a mere direct storytelling experience. Everything is left just loose enough, and the questions it raises through natural gameplay are just intriguing enough for the player to create their own ideas or a philosophical outlook when it comes to their own actions. This sort of perspectivist approach to the game design makes Alpha Centauri and other games like it stand out among so many others who have been forgotten to time, and keeps what is otherwise a fairly primitive strategy game experience engaging as well as intellectually stimulating to this day. For me personally, I appreciate the affirmative nature of the game, how despite all the evils and atrocities, man can still be redeemed and achieve salvation. Brian Reynolds could have taken a more cliche route, one that either ends in a nihilistic point or else acts as some sort of warning of doom for mankind, like don't destroy the climate, oh the planet's going to die if you do that. However, despite this teasing, he never does fully step in this direction. It's poignant that the final cinematic for the Ascent to Transcendence, there are 7 figures depicted as joining in the ceremony. All 7 of the lost tribes of man, finally united in the face of the divine. The pursuit of truth has always been deeply relevant for man, today more so than ever, so an ultimately positive conclusion to a sci-fi story is the kind I enjoy most of all, as these stories ultimately serve to uplift the spirit rather than crush it further. Miriam as well is redeemed in the end. Indeed, humanity should not be afraid or feel the need to negate itself in slavery, but rather embrace its own humanity and trust in the power of God to see things through. It's only fitting that canonically it seems that the Gaians, the most pro-humanist faction still standing, appear to be the ones who make this crucial leap of faith on behalf of all mankind.
The righteous need not cower before the drumbeat of human progress. Though the song of yesterday fades into the challenge of tomorrow, God still watches and judges us. Evil lurks in the data links as it lurked in the streets of yesteryear. But it was never the streets that were evil. Sister Miriam Godwinson, The Blessed Struggle.
And remember guys, if you like the kind of content I make here, remember to like the video and subscribe to my channel. It really helps me out a lot. But either way guys, I'll see you again next time. So goodbye everyone.